Welcome to the Using Node.js video series from MarkLogic University. This video is the second part in a series of topics covering the use of the MarkLogic Node.js client API. This video is divided into two parts. The first part is for those who are already experienced with both MarkLogic and Node.js, and we'll look at an example designed to give you a quick start in getting you off the ground and being able to perform inserts and reads using the Node.js client API. The second part is for those who are less experienced with either MarkLogic or Node.js. And here we'll take some time to explain these concepts from the ground up, including how to use MarkLogic and Node.js to set up a REST instance, create a database client, load data into the database, read data from the database, and use the callback, promise, and stream result handling patterns. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to download and install both MarkLogic and Node.js. And as we progress throughout this tutorial, we'll refer to different pieces of code and examples. These examples are available through the MarkLogic University GitHub site. You can go to this site, get the examples on your local machine, and follow along. Let's get started with an example of using the MarkLogic Node.js client API to insert a document into a database and read that document back from a database. Now, if you're new to MarkLogic and Node, don't worry if some of this terminology doesn't make sense. We'll walk you through everything in more detail as the tutorial progresses. So I'm going to start out from the command line in the project directory. And this project directory is available to you if you go out to our MarkLogic University GitHub site. You can download it and you can follow along at home. To get started, I'm going to do an npm init, and that's going to ask me a couple basic questions to help create my package.json file. So we'll give it a name of quick start. It's version 1. We really don't need a description. It sees app.js in this project folder, and so we'll keep that as our entry point to our application. And I can leave some of these other options blank as well. We'll add the author here as MLU, and we'll accept the default license. And it's going to prompt me to go ahead and create this package.json file. So I'm going to say yes to that. Next, what we need to do then is add the MarkLogic client API as a dependency to the package.json file and actually install the MarkLogic Node.js client API. So to do so, I'm going to key in npm install MarkLogic and pass it the parameter save. That save parameter will add this as a dependency in our package.json file. So I enter that. And once it's complete, we could then go out on our file system and look at our project directory. And we're going to notice that we now have a folder called Node Modules in there, and inside of there is the MarkLogic client API. We could also open our project directory in our favorite editor of choice and take a look at the resulting package.json that was created for us. And we'll notice all of those parameters that we entered, as well as MarkLogic defined as a dependency. So now that we've initialized our project, let's take a look at our actual application code. So in our text editor, let's take a look at app.js. And when we look at app.js, the first thing we'll see is that we're going to import the MarkLogic Node.js client API, and then we are going to go and set up a database client. All the interactions between your application and MarkLogic server are through a MarkLogic.database client object. And here we're configuring the database client to connect to an application server using our admin user credentials. Now this application server exists right out of the box after you've installed and initialized MarkLogic, and it's set up to talk to a database in MarkLogic called documents. Next, you'll see that we define some additional variables. One for the URI, which will identify the document in the database, and one for the document itself, which in this example is a simple Hello World JSON document. Then you see that we use dbclient.documents.write to load the document into the database at the assigned URI. We use a promise to ensure that the document write is complete before we try to perform the read. Then we use dbclient.documents.read to go out and get the document from the database at the specified URI. And then we output the contents of that document in the console. Now let's go back to our project directory at the command line and test our application. So I'm going to key in node app.js and run my app. And what we'll see is the results of our application, which has inserted that document into the database, then read the document back from the database, outputting the response of that document here for us in the console. So we've now done our first insert and read using the MarkLogic Node.js client API. If you're new to MarkLogic and Node.js, please continue to follow this tutorial and we'll discuss these concepts in more detail. So think back to the first episode in this series where we took a look at the GeoPhotos app. This app was built on MarkLogic 8 and implemented using a three-tiered architecture consisting of an AngularJS front end, a Node.js middle tier, and a MarkLogic database backend. This tutorial is less concerned with front-end development, so we're going to narrow our focus to the Node.js middle tier and the MarkLogic database backend. We provide a Node.js client API. It's a package that you can install from npm, and this API allows Node.js middleware to communicate with the MarkLogic database in a fluent Node.js interface. From the API, you can manage documents, build sophisticated search queries and aggregates, and perform many other functions without having to leave the developer's familiar Node.js environment. This is a really easy way to get going in a Node.js environment, even if you know very little about MarkLogic. Now, under the covers, the Node.js API communicates over HTTP to a rich set of REST-style data services that come built into MarkLogic. And these out-of-the-box services provide the fundamentals of document management, search, aggregates, alerting, and they enable you to build some robust applications. We've done a lot of work to make sure that each of these data services encapsulates all of the best practices for both performance and scalability. And what's nice about this framework is that for those cases where the built-in data services don't provide you the level of granularity that your application needs, we also provide a comprehensive set of extensibility hooks. So using one of MarkLogic's server-side languages, for example JavaScript or xQuery, a developer can write code that runs as close to the bare metal as possible within the database. So in order to get started using the Node.js client API, we're going to first have to create our REST instance inside of MarkLogic. And then requests made from the Node.js client API will be handled by this REST instance. Now, a REST instance is a MarkLogic HTTP application server configured to use the MarkLogic REST APIs and set up to communicate with the specific content and modules database for your project. To create a new REST instance for your project, the MarkLogic Client REST API provides a service, specifically /v1/REST APIs. And this service or endpoint makes it easy to stand up a new REST instance and the necessary databases and forests for your project. On a fresh MarkLogic install, you can run this request against port 8002, which is a REST instance that exists by default after you have initialized that MarkLogic host. And when you post to this endpoint, it will create for you a new REST instance and its necessary databases based on this configuration data that you provide to it in the request. And here we see that configuration data modeled as JSON, where we're defining things like the name of this REST instance, the group in our MarkLogic cluster to which it should belong, and then the names of the content and modules databases. And if those databases don't exist, they will automatically get created for us. And finally, we see the port number that the HTTP application server will be defined at. Now, we could use any HTTP client that we prefer in order to build this request. But since the scope of this tutorial is all about Node.js, we're going to use Node.js to actually script the setup of our REST instance. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing to do to get started is to take a look at our project directory. Now, I've gone ahead and placed this project directory right off the root of my C drive in a folder called Using Node.js with a subfolder dedicated to this episode, episode 2. The information that's in this episode 2 folder is all of the data that's coming off of the GitHub site. So if you have cloned that locally, you can place it wherever you want. Just keep in mind of where you have placed that information. Now let's take a look at the setup.js file. And if we go and open that in our favorite text editor, we'll get a chance to look at that code. And the first thing we'll notice is that we see that it requires the following: Bluebird and request. Bluebird is a promise implementation library. It enables us to build a promise chain to create a sequence of synchronous events. Request is designed to be a simple way to make HTTP calls. This will enable us to build the HTTP request to the MarkLogic client REST API. Both Bluebird and request are NPM packages. So in order to run this code, we will first need to install those packages in our project directory, which we can do directly from the command line since we have NPM set up. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up my command prompt, and I've already navigated to my project directory. And so the first thing I want to do is install Bluebird. So I'm simply going to do an npm install and then Bluebird. And then the second thing I'm going to do is to install request. So I'm going to do an npm install request. And once it's finished, you'll notice back here in our project directory that we now have a folder called Node Modules, and inside of here are the two packages that I have just installed through npm, Bluebird and request. Okay, so we've set up some of these prerequisites. Now let's go ahead and go back to the code to take a look at some of the other things that are going on here. And the first thing that we'll see is the definition of several different variables. The first set of variables is defining all of our account credentials and information about our MarkLogic instance, such as the host name and the port number of the REST instance that we're going to use to make this initial request. Then we see a variable called REST_config, and in this variable we have the JSON data that's outlining the new REST instance that we're going to be creating based upon our request. We see that we're giving it a name of node example, and it should create for us a database called node example content and a modules database called node example modules. And it should set that application server up on port 6000. Next, let's take a look at how we're going to run the actual setup script. We can simply go out to our command prompt and execute the script by keying in node and then the name of the file that we wish to run. And in this case, it is setup.js. However, this specific script was designed to accept a couple of different command line parameters, specifically one called bootstrap and one called wipe, where the bootstrap parameter tells it to stand up the new instance based on our defined requirements, and the wipe option tells it to tear down or remove that instance. If we explore the code, we can see how that command line parameter is passed in. And so what we see down here is a case for the bootstrap parameter and a case for the wipe parameter. And if we pass in bootstrap, it's going to call the function called bootstrap. So we could then find that function to start to explore what is actually going to happen when we run this. And when we look at the bootstrap function here, we see that it's leveraging some other functions where it's going to, one, check for the existence of the application server based on the configuration data in that REST config variable. And if that application server does not exist, then we're going to take a specific action, and that action would be to go ahead and build the request to the MarkLogic REST API, specifically the v1 REST API's endpoint, and create that new REST instance. And if the application server has already been created, meaning we've ran this script once before or you already have something at that port, then we're simply going to do nothing at all. So let's go ahead and execute this script. So we'll key in here at the command line node setup.js, and we'll pass in the bootstrap parameter. And we hit enter. That will kick off the execution here. We get some logging indicating what's happening, telling us that the app server and databases are being set up. And then we get a response when that bootstrap has completed. So let's go ahead and check it out. I'm going to open up a browser and go out to my admin interface and take a look to make sure that these new resources do in fact exist. And sure enough, we see an application server defined here out at port 6000. And we see a database called node example content and node example modules. And we see respective forests for each of those databases as well. Excellent. So we now have our REST instance set up. Now let's go ahead and look at how we can use this REST instance to talk to a MarkLogic database from our Node.js middle tier. In order to use the MarkLogic Node.js client API, we need to perform a few basic steps. First, we're going to need to install the API. Then we're going to need to import it into a project. Then we're going to need to create a database client. And then we need to understand this concept of the document descriptor and document metadata, because we're going to need to build that document descriptor in order to perform a write. And we'll also see that when we perform a read, that what gets returned to us is a document descriptor. So we need to be able to understand how to work with that data. The first thing that we'll need to do is to install the MarkLogic Node.js client API, which we can do using npm. So if you think back to what we did when we set up our REST instance, we used npm to install Bluebird and request. We're going to follow very similar steps to install MarkLogic. So from the command prompt, I'm going to navigate to my project directory, and I'm going to key in npm install MarkLogic. And that's going to install the MarkLogic Node.js client API into that project directory. And when it's finished, you should be able to go out into the project directory and look into the Node modules folder, and you will now see the MarkLogic API in there. So once the API has been installed, the next step is to start to build some project code and import that API and create a database client. So let's take a look at example1.js. And the first thing that you'll notice is that we import the MarkLogic client API. And here we're storing it in a variable that we simply call MarkLogic. The second thing that you'll notice is a variable called coninfo, which describes the REST instance that we have created and how we are going to authenticate against that REST instance. And then we see the definition of our database client. We make a call to marklogic.createDatabaseClient and pass it our connection info. Now that we have our database client created, we can use it to perform writes and reads. In order to do that, we first need to understand what it is we are going to build and write, and what is going to be returned to us when we perform a read. And that's where understanding the document descriptor becomes important. When we write or read data, we are managing not only the document content itself, but also all of the document's metadata, which includes collections, properties, quality, and permissions. Let's say, for example, that we have a JSON document that represents a recipe, and this recipe is for cherry pie. And when you put that document in the database, you're going to assign it a URI, and that's the identifier for that document in the database. And you can also assign it to 0, 1, or many collections. Now think of collections like tags on a document. They're very useful for organizing documents in a database and for constraining queries against particular sets of documents in that database. Collections are also very flexible. The documents in a collection can be of different document types or structures, and they can all still coexist within that collection. Let's say the cherry pie recipe document might be added to our database and placed in a collection called recipes, as well as a collection called pies and desserts. You could visualize that as looking like this. Now let's say that we add another recipe to our database, and this recipe represents the classic cocktail, the Manhattan. This document about the Manhattan might also be in the recipes collection, and maybe another collection for cocktails. But it's not in the collection for pies or desserts. We could visualize the organization of our database in this way. Now, collection metadata is going to be very useful when we go to query that database later on. If you search for documents in the recipes collection that contain a specific ingredient, such as cherries, you would match both the Manhattan and the cherry pie recipes. But if you search for documents in the recipes collection and the cocktails collection that contain the ingredient cherries, you would only match the Manhattan document. Properties are additional metadata that you can store about a document, but that metadata is not contained in the document itself. So for example, maybe I have some sort of annotation about the source of a recipe, such as my grandmother's cookbook. I could choose to store that in a separate document related to my cherry pie recipe, and that separate document is what we refer to as the properties fragment. Another piece of document metadata that we can manage is quality. Quality enables you to give some documents more importance than others, and this can impact search results that are based on relevancy calculations. So for example, maybe this recipe for a Manhattan received a lot of positive feedback from users of your application. You could use that in order to boost its quality ranking, which would then impact where it lands in relevancy ranked search results. MarkLogic implements a role-based security model. A user must have a role with a read permission on a document in order to see that document. And this permission information is metadata about a given document. So let's say, for example, that we created a role that indicates whether a user was of legal drinking age. Only users with that role should be able to search documents that are in the cocktails collection. If I'm a user that has that role, and I search the recipes collection for documents that contain the ingredient cherries, I'm going to see Manhattan in my results. But if I'm a user who does not have that role, when I search for documents in the recipes collection that contain the ingredient cherries, the Manhattan document is not even considered. So in summary, when inserting a document using Node.js, what we're really going to be managing is the document descriptor. This defines not only the document content, but all of its metadata. And likewise, when we read a document using Node.js, what we will be returning is a document descriptor. And here we see an example of a document descriptor where you can see these different pieces of metadata that are being managed and the document itself, where the document itself is defined in the content property of the JSON data. Now let's take a look at this in action. Back in our editor, let's take another look at the code in example1.js. And we're going to study this example and see that it performs an insert transaction. So we can see right after the definition of our database client that we are creating a few more variables. Specifically, we have a variable for the URI of the document that we're going to insert, a variable containing the JSON document data that we will load, and in this case it's a recipe for tofu soup. And we also see a variable defining the document descriptor. And if we look at the types of things that we're defining in this document descriptor, we've kept it simple here for this example. We're defining things like the URI, the content type, the document data itself, and we decided to add it to some collections as well. Now, scrolling down further in the code, we can see how the insert will actually happen. And if we look at this example, we see that we use dbclient.documents.write to load the document defined in the document descriptor. Now this example is using a callback result handling pattern. We call the result function, passing in a success and error callback function. If successful, we simply log a message to the console. If an error were to occur, we would output that error information instead. This result pattern can be used when you don't need to synchronize results with other events in your application. Now let's test this code at the command line. So here in the command prompt, to run the code, I'm just going to key in node and then example1.js. And we see our response that indicates it has finished with the write of this document. Now, to test that this was a success, we could go out to Query Console and explore our node example content database. And sure enough, we see our new document there. And we see that it's part of a collection called recipes, food, vegetarian, and soup. And if I click on this document, we would see the actual JSON contents of our tofu soup recipe. Now, this is a tutorial all about Node.js, so rather than using Query Console to validate that the insert was successful, let's use Node.js to read that document back from the database. So back in our editor, let's take a look now at example2.js. And here we see that we have some of the same standard stuff in place. We require the MarkLogic API, and we create our database client connection using our REST instance information. We also see that we have a variable defined indicating the URI of the document that we wish to read. Because it's just a real simple example, we want to validate that the insert was successful. So what we're then going to do in this example is we're going to use dbclient.documents.read in order to go out and get that document from the database. And we use the result function in a callback pattern to look at the response. So let's scroll down here to see this full code in action. Now, for the purposes of exploring some of the data in this example, we're going to output a few different pieces of information in the console. We're outputting the full document descriptor, as well as the full JSON document contents, and finally, just the name property of that JSON document. And the goal here is just to show you some different ways of interacting with this response data. So now let's go ahead and test example2.js at the command line. So I'm going to go over here and key in node example2.js and run that code. And we see that we have the document descriptor in its entirety output. We have the document itself, and we also have the recipe name, tofu soup. Now, if you recall, in our first example, we used a callback result handling pattern. And we said that this result pattern can be used when you don't need to synchronize results with other events in your application. But what if you do need to synchronize events? For example, what if you need to insert a document and then read it from the database? You would want to make sure that the insert was complete before trying to read it back from the database. The solution in Node.js is to use a promise. A promise lets you work with the results of an asynchronous event and chain interactions together. Let's take a look at example3.js, which implements a promise result handling pattern. First off, we see some of the standard things that we need in any Node.js application with MarkLogic. We first import the API, set up the database client, and define a document. And in this case, the document that we're defining is a recipe for our Manhattan. Then we define the document descriptor, and in this case we're going to define that at a URI, and we're going to specify the contents of that document, and we're going to add it to a collection called recipes and cocktails. Then we see all the action. We use dbclient.documents.write to load the document defined in the document descriptor. And then we see .result. .result returns a promise, and promises have .then, .catch, and .finally methods. The success callback you pass to the promises .then method is not invoked until the interaction with MarkLogic is complete. And when it is complete, then we log a message and then proceed with performing a read of the newly inserted document, and then process the results of that read with a standard callback result handling pattern. Let's take a look at this in action. So I'm going to go back to my command prompt, and I'm going to run node example3.js. And I see the log statement on the console indicating that the write is complete, and then I see the read of that document from the database. In our final example in this episode, we'll take a look at using the stream result handling pattern. Let's imagine that our recipe book application has not only recipes modeled as JSON documents, but also other content about recipes, such as pictures or videos. These types of documents can also be managed by the database, like any other document, and MarkLogic supports over 200 different types of binary documents in the database. But binaries, for example, an MP4 movie file, could be large. Using a stream is a good idea anytime you have to work with either large documents or large results sets. And you can stream both on ingest and read. In this example, we're going to stream a document on ingest. So let's take a look at example4.js. The first thing that might jump out at you when you look at this code is that you now see that we're requiring FS. FS is a standard part of Node.js which enables us to manage file system I/O. So there's no need to do an npm install because it is a standard part of Node.js. After that, we have our standard stuff that we have with the MarkLogic API, such as requiring the MarkLogic API, setting up our database client. And then we see a couple variables that are used to actually point to the image that we're going to load in this example. Then we get down to the part where we see the real action. In here we see that we use dbclient.documents.createWriteStream to build our document descriptor. And we use fs.createReadStream to pipe the contents of our image file from the file system to our writable stream. And then we process the result. So let's test it out now and see the result. So I'm going to go over here to the command prompt and execute this code. And it's example4.js. And we see that we get our responses here telling us that we started a stream and that the write is then complete. And so we could validate this by simply going out to Query Console and doing an explore against our database. And what we should now see is that we have our two recipe JSON documents from earlier, and we also have an image document here. And we can see inside of the database that it is of a type of binary. And if we click on that image, we can actually serve it up from the database. And there is our picture of the Manhattan cocktail. Let's take a look at one final project to bring together everything that we've learned throughout our tutorial. And as we mentioned before, the main focus of this tutorial has been on the Node.js middle tier and the MarkLogic database backend. And our first few examples were designed to be as simple as possible. But for our final project, we're going to implement an example exercising the full three-tiered architecture, so you can get a glimpse of how to work with your data on the front end as well. And as a part of this final example, we're also going to implement a more realistic security model so that we're no longer creating our database client as the MarkLogic administrator. And we'll also take a look at implementing a package.json file to manage all the project dependencies, and separating out our database client connection information into its own module that will enable us to then create a pool of database client connections that our application can use as needed. As we mentioned earlier, MarkLogic implements a role-based security model. And in order to keep our first examples really simple, we defined our database client using our MarkLogic admin account. And it's through the database client that we authenticate against our REST instance. However, in the real world, very few people are MarkLogic admins, and it's not a realistic scenario to use the admin account in your applications. With MarkLogic, it's easy for us to set up a more realistic security implementation for our project. Out of the box, MarkLogic provides some pre-built roles for working with the REST API. Specifically, there's a role called REST Reader, REST Writer, and REST Admin. And because our Node.js middle tier communicates to our database through our REST instance, we can also take advantage of these default roles. We just need to create some application-specific users for our project. So let's start by creating those new users. One way to create a new user in MarkLogic is to use the admin interface. I'm going to use this approach in order to create the 3 users for our final project. So I'm going to open the admin interface and click on Security, and then click on Users, and click on Create to build a new user. And we need to give them a username and a password and assign them a role. So for our first user, I'm going to call this my reader user. And to keep things simple, I'm going to give them a very simple password, the word training in all lowercase. And then I repeat that password. And then the last step here in creating a new user is to give them a role. And those REST roles that we discussed are all predefined roles that exist out of the box when you install MarkLogic. And so I'm going to find the role for a REST reader in my list here and assign that role. And here we see our REST reader role. So I click on that and click OK. And I've now created my user and given them the appropriate role. We're now going to repeat those steps to create a REST Writer user and a REST Admin user. And once we've finished creating those users, we can review our configuration by clicking on Security and Users, and we'll see that we now have 3 users, my admin user, my reader user, and my writer user. They have been assigned the appropriate roles for using the REST API. And for simplicity, they've all been given a password, the word training in lowercase. Next, let's deploy our final project. And if you recall, back when we set up our first few examples, we installed packages for Bluebird, Request, and MarkLogic directly from the command line using npm. And this works, and it's simple. But in a real-world project, it's quite possible for you to have many more dependencies that you would need to install. So a better approach would be to structure the project with a package.json file to define all of those dependencies. Then all we need to do is go out to our project folder at the command line and do an npm install, and it will automatically install all the dependencies defined in the package.json file. Now, if you look at this package.json file, you might notice that there's a new package that we haven't seen before called Express. Express provides tooling for HTTP servers, and it's what we'll use for our front end in this example application. Next, let's take a look at our application code, and we'll start with connections.js. Here we see that we are defining and exporting 3 different connection configurations. and we're taking advantage of our newly created users. We export this information, and then if we go and look at app.js, we'll see that we import this information from connections.js. And then we create a pool of different database clients. One database client using our read user, one database client using our write user, and then a third database client using our admin user. And for the scope of what we're trying to accomplish in this application, all we really need is our read database client, which is defined at the variable dbRead. Next, let's take a look at the route definition. Here we have a standard express route definition that is going to handle any route using a regular expression. The get method that you see at the route definition handles the HTTP method of get. In other words, if someone issues an HTTP GET request against any endpoint, it should be handled by the function called displayImage. Now, displayImage is our standard express function that has a request and response object. We're going to pass in the URI of the document we wish to read as the first parameter. Then we'll use our read database client and the documents.read function to stream the results of the document in chunks and display it in the browser. So to run our application and test it, we'll need to go over to our project directory at the command line and enter in node app.js. And this tells us that our app server is now running. And if you think back to our code, we defined that application server on port 3000. And so we should be able to then open a browser, go to port 3000, and pass in a URI and view that image. So let's test it out. And here we'll see that I'm passing in the URI of the image document that we loaded in our last example. And here we see the image of our Manhattan streamed from the database and delivered to us in the browser tier of our three-tiered architecture. In this tutorial, we have explored how to use Node.js to set up a REST instance, create a database client, load data into the database, read data from the database, and use the callback, promise, and stream result handling patterns. As a next step, make sure you go out to our developer community site and download MarkLogic. You can get a free developer license and walk through these examples on your own machine. To access the examples in this episode, go out to the MarkLogic University GitHub site. To get the geophoto app that we discussed in episode 1, go out to the MarkLogic GitHub site. And if you need additional training and assistance, check out all the other on-demand tutorials that we have to offer, as well as our free instructor-led training as well.